But for us, when we're talking about a flourishing neighborhood, we do believe that that is something that can be seen, quantified, measured, and tracked. So it's not just mission statement and kind of flowery conceptual language of flourishing. We do believe there is a way to describe and define and measure what
Oh,
we
so it's
mean
not
by.
just how many warm fuzzies did you count today? Like, oh, I got a hug from a neighbor.
We
That's
count
one.
those.
That's one.
We do count those,
Yeah.
David. Don't discredit the hugs. Welcome to Place Matters, a podcast about the intersection of race, place, and poverty. We will explore the belief that the path towards ending inequity and promoting prosperity is through the work of holistic neighborhood development. The content for this podcast is based on over 45 years of experience, expertise, failure, and hope from our organization, Focused Community Strategies, better known as FCS. This is the Foundations series, where we will talk about the big ideas and core frameworks that make FCS, well, FCS. I am Shawn Duncan, the Director of Training and Consulting for FCS and the host for Place Matters. What is success in the work of poverty alleviation? How do you measure it? Some have made it pretty simple. A poor person shouldn't be poor anymore. That sounds good, but what does that mean? Is it enough to say that our goal is just to increase income? Is this just a matter of dollars? While we may wish this was the case, because it would be much easier undertaking if it was, we know success isn't a country full of financially independent individuals. The goal isn't more money and more stuff in the hands of those who currently have too little, though arguably that would be much better than where we are now. However, the true goal is much more dynamic, multidimensional, and transformative than that. The end to which we are striving is flourishing neighborhoods, places where all people, regardless of income, have the chance to thrive. But as beautiful as that vision is, the question still remains, what exactly is a flourishing neighborhood? How do you define it, and how can you measure it? Joining me today in this conversation is one of our lead consultants, David Park. In this episode, we are going to explore the question, what is a flourishing neighborhood?
Yeah, and the way it's often asked is like, how do I know
You're right.
what it looks like? Are we anywhere close? Are we in the neighborhood of a flourishing neighborhood? Like, what is it? Yeah, what is it?
Yeah. Oh man, I find all the time that people will say, like, I love your mission, I love your mission statement, I love your catchphrase of empowering neighborhoods to thrive. Like, I'm all in, but once I get on the ground and start doing this, what are you talking about here?
Right.
What's the actual thing? Like, it's easier to say, like, I want to build 4 houses. Like, that's very measurable. Seems very clean,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
But for us, when we're talking about a flourishing neighborhood, we do believe that that is something that can be seen, quantified, measured, and tracked. So it's not just mission statement and kind of flowery conceptual language of flourishing. We do believe there is a way to describe and define and measure what
Oh,
we
so it's
mean
not
by.
just how many warm fuzzies did you count today? Like, oh, I got a hug from a neighbor.
We
That's
count
one.
those.
That's one.
We do count those,
Yeah.
David. Don't discredit the hugs. But for us, we put the idea of measuring the health of a neighborhood, whether they're flourishing or not, into kind of 3 major categories. So there's social cohesion, structural integrity, and economic vitality. So those are the 3 big categories that we would say any neighborhood you want to test, right, to see, is it healthy, is it harmful, is it thriving, is it flourishing? These are the places where we would say this is how you begin to identify kind of aspects of flourishing.
Social cohesion, structural integrity, and economic vitality. Okay, so those are the 3 big buckets of how we're measuring flourishing neighborhood. Let's start with social cohesion.
Yeah, and for each of the 3 categories, I'm trying to give like a singular word to give us kind of another hook to hang on this. So primarily when we're talking about a neighborhood and its social cohesion, what we're looking at is this idea of belonging. So a flourishing neighborhood is going to be characterized by a place where neighbors know they belong. They know they belong to each other, and they know that they belong to that place. So belonging for us is the shorthand of what we mean by, does this neighborhood exhibit the characteristics of social cohesion?
How do you create or what kinds of things create a sense of belonging in a neighborhood?
Yeah. And I think that's where, one of our core values around neighboring, our commitments to proximity is a part of this, that it's, even though the work of like large scale development is harder, in a weird kind of way, it's easier for people to somewhat focus on, because it's like, oh, I can see the bricks and sticks. I can see dirt moving.
That's right.
I can see things built. And I would say more often than even talking about housing type stuff or built environment type stuff, we end up talking to a lot of our clients and partners more often about the social cohesion piece, which is like, are you building the social infrastructure, the social fabric of a place, which we would say is actually, amongst all the indicators of a healthy neighborhood, it's the lead indicator. Meaning, if you have two neighborhoods that somehow are, all the data points online say the exact same things about both neighborhoods, we would say if one of them has greater social cohesion, they will actually self-report being in a better, healthier, stronger, more hopeful place.
Wow.
And so for us, this social cohesion part, and it's not even just about like interpersonal relationships. So people hear us talk about we need social cohesion, we need a sense of belonging, and they tend to say, okay, so this is like neighbors who know each other's names, and they share meals together, they celebrate each other's birthdays, and they support each other in the laws of life. Say yes to that, absolutely. So one of the main indicators we are looking at is neighborhood connectivity and the interpersonal side. But actually, that's only one component of multiple.
Oh, phew.
When we're talking about, yeah.
I was like, do I know my neighbor's birthdays?
Well, the good news is,
I barely even know my own family's birthdays. That's hard enough to keep up with. So, okay, good. So there are other measures of social cohesion.
One of the things we think about is like, is there credible and active leadership in that neighborhood? Right?
I see.
Are there a group of residents, citizens, neighbors who are working together on behalf of that neighborhood to organize its wills, its wishes, its wants, its future, and are actively working for the betterment of their neighborhood? So do you have credible leadership within there? We're also looking at this idea that for us is profoundly important, is this idea of like sense of place. So it's not just do I sense like I belong to my neighbor, like I'm connected to my neighbor as a person, but do I believe I belong to this place?
Right.
Does the story of this place include my story? Right.
Wow.
Can I, even as simple as like nothing that big and meaningful, could I tell you what the boundaries of this place is, and does it have a name? Do I have a sense of connectivity to that history, to that story, to that identity? As well as just other infrastructures that make civic social life occur, right? Are there gardening clubs? Are there parks clubs? Is there a civic league that contains the leadership of the organization? Are there religious institutions that are playing a healthy role in the neighborhood? So just looking at what are those, whether they're institutional or interpersonal, what are the dynamics that are really keeping a strong social fabric in a neighborhood? So for us, if you're going to say, hey, we're about flourishing places, one of the big categories is really around this idea of social cohesion, or belonging to a place and belonging to each other.
That's really interesting, because I think as social media and sort of like the transience of people throughout for opportunities or just preference, like it's really interesting to see how sometimes people land lightly, or are sort of tourists in their own cities sometimes. But you're talking about something for a neighborhood to flourish. You really need actually the opposite. The countercultural sense of like, no, let's get some rootedness, and are you from Northwoods? Are you from East Side? Are you West Side? Like, are you from the city of whatever? That is a really powerful factor in measuring cohesion.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the challenges of the model that we would promote, is that we're not just challenging a charity paradigm about how you respond to poverty and the related issues that come with it. We're kind of changing a cultural paradigm to say that you've got to get replaced. Automobiles, internet, all these things like streaming services, social media, all this allows us to kind of hover above place where we can be a resident but not a neighbor. And so the invitation is not just to kind of challenge a paradigm of charity, but it's a challenge, kind of a way of life. Am I being rooted into that place amongst people? And it takes a deliberate choice, right? I'm grateful for the beauties of technology, transportation, allow me to travel and experience all these different places or connect with people, like some of my best friends who are hundreds and hundreds of miles away that I'm not going to see but every few years, like that I can connect easily with them.
Right.
But if I have kind of a deeper affection for the personalities on the TV show I'm streaming that I do for the actual people in my neighborhood. Like I'm displaced, and I need to be replaced, right, to
Yeah.
settled in that
That's like a
environment.
bigger version of sort of like this. I feel like there's this move in like wholeness and self-help to be more embodied, you know.
Yeah.
So this
Yep.
it's sort of an extension of that, being embodied in a neighborhood
Yeah.
or embodying, uh, owning some of that as
Yeah,
part of my
yeah.
neighborhood.
Yeah, and FCS has a history of being a faith-based organization, and for those that followed the Judeo-Christian scriptures, one of the key verses in there is this idea of Jesus one time saying that the top two commands are that you're loving God with all your heart and you're loving your neighbor as yourself. And so a lot of people have like condensed that down to like the core of the religious work is to love God and love others. But I think that's a shift that's not warranted, right? Jesus said, "Love your neighbor, not just others." I'm not saying you don't have to love people who are your neighbors, but Jesus is articulating something very practical, something like neighbor, nearby, like it's easy for me to love others because if I disconnect from my neighborhood, I can say, "Well, I love the people I go to church with, or love the people that I work with, or I love my friends in cities 4 states away that I connect with on social media," but I don't have to actually love that which is nearby.
Yeah,
I don't have to love my local city council. I don't have to love the complaining neighbor across the street. I don't have to
Right.
love the loud music next door, the guy who's been
yeah,
working on his car for 10 years straight in his driveway. Like, I don't love all that, right? I can love others in a generic kind of way. But I think this call to say, now, how do we love with that which is nearby? And whether that's the people nearby or the civic structures that form the fabric of a place, like, loving it doesn't mean necessarily approving of it and being happy with it. Like, but to love it means you enter into it, right?
right. As an action and
Yeah.
as a way
Yep.
of being, not
Right.
just as a. Wow, this is a really radical redefining of social cohesion. That's not just interpersonal relationships, and it's more about proximity and sort of embodiment. Is there another dimension of social cohesion that you're thinking of?
I mean, I think the other dimension of it is actually teased out in the other big buckets. I think one of the challenges, even though we're mentioning 3 buckets, it is if you're doing this work well, it is going to be really difficult to tease them out completely, right? Because the other dynamic of social cohesion is all of the initiatives that might technically fit in the other 2 buckets.
Okay.
We try to do them in such a way that they're increasing the social fabric.
Okay.
Right. So sometimes we think, oh, we need programs for social cohesion. We start thinking about picnics or block parties or, again, all the relational stuff, interpersonal stuff. We say, yeah, absolutely.
Right.
But even when we think about these other 2 categories of structural integrity, economic vitality, when we're doing anything in those categories technically, we are never not thinking about how does this impact the social cohesion of this neighborhood? How does it bring people out so they belong together? How does it root people in so they belong to their place?
Right.
Not just how do we improve the structural integrity or add economic development. Like we're thinking through that lens always, right? And that's a piece that can't be missed.
I feel like there's a common theme that's running in our conversations, is sort of the interrelatedness of all
Man.
things, right?
Yeah. Which is why, so when we talk about our work, and there's lots of different categories that people kind of label or place socially good work. And for us, as we've kind of wrestled through, how do we name what we do? Are we place-based? Are we a community development? Are we nonprofit? Are we asset-based community development? And all these are valuable terms, and there's no critique there, but it's been helpful for us to say, well, what we do, our practice is holistic neighborhood development.
Okay.
There's nothing magical about those words. It is not poetically, it just roll right off the tongue.
Right.
But for us, it's because that word holistic is this sense that this is a profound dynamic interplay of all pieces, people, sectors, parts, right? That there's no way to influence one piece without influencing the others.
Right.
And any idea of like isolated point solutions to address one issue with one intervention it just doesn't play out on the nature of what a neighborhood actually is, being that ecosystem.
Well, and it makes sense because you can't parse these out as though they could just be separate things. And when we were talking about a flourishing neighborhood, if it was just about social cohesion, we just buy a bunch of big tents and picnic tables and eat together and laugh together and play board games. But so if social cohesion is one dimension, tell me more about structural integrity.
Yeah. And with that, you made me think about something else before we switch to that, is that there are a number of neighborhoods that would measurably rank low in economic vitality or structural integrity, but could measurably rank really high on social cohesion.
Huh.
Their sense of history, their sense of place,
Right.
their sense of sometimes like we got to care for each other because ain't nobody else going to do it.
Ah.
You know, and so what can happen is when we enter into those places, we completely overlook. Like one of the, like, because again, for us, remember, we feel like the social cohesion bucket is the lead bucket. Like it's what carries, like it brings everything else up. Or conversely, it can bring everything else down, even though you're doing work in those places. So like for those practitioners out there, that as you're entering into partnership with neighborhood, to be aware, hey, if there's a strong fabric of belief and pride in the history of this neighborhood's life and story, if they have a sense of identity in that place, if they have a network of care, even if it's unofficial, it's not a incorporated neighborhood association or whatever, but like,
Right. That's an asset.
lean in.
Yeah, that's
Because like if you've got that, the other stuff is profoundly easier. I didn't say easy. It'll never be easy, but it is profoundly
Less
easy.
hard.
Yeah, it's a whole different degree of work. But when you're, so like pay attention that if that is a strong piece, like that is going to be the lever by which any of this other good stuff kind of really begins to happen.
This is very Tai Chi of you because, like, I think there are other communities, like you're saying, like maybe they're so structured, they have so many structures that there's less cohesion.
Oh yeah.
So like, we've got all these, banks, strong strong district, blah, 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 but we're wealthy in all those things except I don't know my neighbor.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, it's hard to create a flourishing neighborhood if y'all don't know your neighbors.
Yeah. Which is why for us, like this is, we're not just defining our work by what poverty problem did you solve. Because if we keep our gaze there, then a neighborhood full of independently wealthy people who don't need each other, that's the goal. And we're like, no, that ain't the goal. Like, because that's, in our mind, that's not a flourishing neighborhood. It's great that you have wonderful schools. It's great that you have safe sidewalks. It's great that you have easy access to high quality health care. It's great that you got all these kind of things. But like if in the movement towards great economic vitality and structural integrity, the social fabric has fallen apart, we would say, hey, your poverty may not be about your AMI or area median income. It may not be about the affordability of your home or the quality of your local schools, but there's this is just kind of deep cultural philosophical stuff for us, is that like the flourishing neighborhood isn't a flourishing neighborhood without this.
Got it. And there's other problems, right? Whether it's depression, addiction, isolation and loneliness, and suicide, which are technically...
Oh, those are poverty, right? Which is part of what we say, like, well, we'll often quantify when we'll say chronic material poverty. We're not saying like short-term material poverty that's accidental, incidental, that's going to be here and gone.
Natural disasters, all that
We're
stuff.
saying like chronic ongoing material poverty is often the place where we're working. And so the neighborhoods we're going to partner with are going to be more identifiable with that type of what you call poverty. But what we wouldn't say is when you drive through maybe some other neighborhoods that have those other two buckets really full and overflowing, we're not going to say, oh, they're flourishing.
Yeah,
right?
that's good.
Yeah.
So say more about what is exactly, now that we sort of know the importance of structural integrity and what it can sometimes mask in terms of like, flourishing neighborhood, they have a barbershop, they have businesses, they've got blah, blah, blah. But actually, what is structural integrity? Like, what are we looking for?
Yeah. So if social cohesion is about belonging, the one word I would put with structural integrity would be access.
Okay.
So if you think about the environment of the neighborhood, I don't just mean like trees and birds, but the ecological and the built environment of a particular place. And that's where you begin to pay attention to all the different systems that make up the supportive network, or what should be a supportive network, to make life function in a place. So you think about like education systems, you think about legal systems and law enforcement, you think about healthcare systems, you think about just social services and resources. So you're beginning to look to say, how does the structural systems work or not work to promote well-being in this neighborhood? And so that really, again, for us can be summarized this idea of access. And so like if you come through, so we're in a neighborhood called Historic South Atlanta, and it's pretty obvious how the structural integrity of this neighborhood was compromised almost from jump, right? So on one border, the railroad runs through here, right? On the other border is it's a connector. So in Atlanta, two major interstates, I-85 and I-75, come together for a few miles in the center of the city, and they call it the connector. So you've essentially got like, feels like 40 lanes.
Yeah, that's right.
Interstate
12
is
lanes of traffic.
what it feels like. And it forms the other border of our neighborhood. And even right into the railroad track barrier, there's a large industrial recycling plant, and there's a large kind of industrial tow yard. And these things are only possible, right, by others' decisions. And so, like, literally, this neighborhood can be cut off from, lack access to the economy, both financial and just social, of the city, right? And so when we think about all these various systems, so there's a literal access that's hard to get to, right?
Physical access.
But also just access of high quality. So even if you have proximate access to health care, is it affordable? Is it high quality? Is it comprehensive enough for you and your family's needs? I think if you tried to talk to pregnant or young mothers in this neighborhood, they would have a different conversation about healthcare access.
Right.
A lot of others would, because their needs are very specific, and it's pretty difficult to get the quality that they need. So when we're thinking structural integrity, we're thinking about how are the systems working or not to provide what is needed for life to exist and exist well, right? So prior to us creating a market grocery store in this neighborhood, it's going to be a 2-hour round trip on public transportation to get to affordable, healthy groceries. You might be able to find a corner market with some bars on the window, and you could get some chips and Cokes or whatever, but if you want groceries that are healthy and affordable, there's no access here, right? And so a lot of that work for us is even just looking at sidewalks, looking at the way streets function or not, looking at the way schools or law enforcement are integrated into, like, trusted partners of neighborhood life, or are they just public institutions that are supposed to promote public good, but can either live at an adversarial relationship to the neighborhood, or can live at just we're just a service provider, but we're kind of cold and distant and clinical from the life of the neighborhood.
Yeah. So you've got the social cohesion, and clearly they're related. Like you said, like a police or law enforcement institution, that structure is necessary for a community to feel safe. But if they have a different kind of relationship where they're not socially tied in, they can either threaten a community or make a neighborhood feel safe.
Yeah. I mean, again, that's the interrelatedness of this, is that when you have a neighborhood that lacks structural integrity, the social cohesion will suffer. So as an example, if our neighborhood, over half of the customers that come to our businesses walk to them. But there's a couple of major kind of state roads that are kind of running right down the vein, the center vein of this neighborhood, that makes it really unsafe. It makes it really loud. It makes it really congested. I'm not going to come out my front door and go walking down Jonesboro to get to somewhere. But if you're improving the safety of those roads, right? If you're improving better, like, the bike lanes or sidewalks, like, now people are saying, I can come out, I can be safe, I can engage my neighbors. If you have better streetlights, people are happy to be out and be interact with one another at night. And so when we think structural integrity, we're not just thinking like, hey, we just need better sidewalks so people don't trip and fall down. I was like, no, this becomes like, it's almost like clearing out arteries so that the body can breathe and function like that, so the blood can pass through. And I think a lot of neighborhood, when you lack structural integrity, the blood can't flow through a neighborhood. And so when we talk about, that's a neighborhood on the other side of the tracks, like, I'd ask us to pay attention to that phrase.
Yeah.
And rather than just saying, like, it's those people happen to live over there past the tracks, as to say, oh, we decided to use that railroad to cut them off from where most of the investment's going to happen to make this city flow and function. And so our work has to be, how do we tear down some of those barriers, literally or figuratively, and ensure there's a greater wovenness of the structures of a neighborhood into itself and into the city that surrounds it.
Okay, so we've got social cohesion for a sense of belonging, and then we've got structural integrity for a sense of access. What's the word for economic vitality?
Yeah, the word there would be opportunity, I think. Social helps us belong to the place. Structural helps the space promote access, and then economics is about economic vitality, is about an environment full of opportunity, right? And so when we're thinking about economic vitality, some may think about, oh, it's jobs. Low income neighborhoods and residents need more jobs, or they need more job training, or they need higher wages. And we say, yeah, absolutely. But making it just about wages or jobs, it really kind of isolates it down into one important idea, kind of removed from the overall. Like, what we're looking for is not just a neighborhood full of employed people. What we want to know is, does a neighborhood's economic life really breathe life into the identity of a neighborhood? So in that, we think about like strong businesses, right? That do those businesses exist in, among, with residents to serve the good of that neighborhood, employ from within that neighborhood, and ensure that they're promoting good things within that neighborhood. That for us, businesses aren't just a place to work so people are employed. We're trying to ask, are the owners of this business, or all of these businesses, like, are they thinking about the impact they have on the ecosystem of that neighborhood? Are they weaving in what their work as a business into the structural integrity of the neighborhood, or into the social cohesion of the neighborhood? Like when we have a cafe, in the neighborhood that we're running, and like, yeah, it employs people, both part-time, but also like full-time, giving people management experience and good benefits and living wages and that kind of thing. Like, and those are all benefits, right? But if you really hear us, like, we talk about the beauty of what's happening there, we're talking about, this is a business where the neighborhood is drawn together to be together and have conversations about itself and its future together. So strong businesses is one of those things, because we want to see the dollars from a neighborhood stay within the neighborhood and circulate in the neighborhood. Like, there's so much research that's been done about particularly Black and brown neighborhoods, that with businesses, so many of those dollars flow out somewhere else, right? They don't circulate and stay within. And so we're thinking about strong businesses. We're also thinking about wealth building, right? Actually in our kind of matrix of indicators for a healthy neighborhood, we put housing in the economic category, because this is means by which you build long-term wealth, right? Although I could easily articulate why housing belongs in one of those others, but for us specifically, we think about housing as a part of economic vitality, because if you're rooted in that neighborhood, you have the greater chance for your dollars to circulate in that neighborhood, but you're also getting a chance for your wealth and your family's wealth to grow over time, right?
Home ownership is a key, or, fundamental way of thinking about wealth building in the United States.
Yeah, so we're, and it's one of the aspects we're working on right now at FCS in historic South Atlanta, is really getting a commercial kind of Main Street, right? Like we've run a few businesses in the neighborhood for a while, but we've had to do so much housing work to just populate the neighborhood and stabilize the neighborhood that it's hard to justify getting businesses to come, because there's just not enough people and dollars. But we're finally at this kind of stage of development to say, like, oh, we can really be thinking about not just having to run and operate business on our own. We can actually begin to recruit Black and brown business owners to be here and do the work here, because they can now sustain. Like, the neighborhood is growing in health. And again, so that's one of those aspects that we're measuring and looking at, is there economic vitality? Meaning, if you grow up in this neighborhood, do you have greater access to economic opportunity? Like, will your wealth grow as you grow, right? Do you have opportunity to be in places with your neighbors? Do you have access to the kinds of businesses that care about you as a person, that are out for the good of this neighborhood, right? And unfortunately, and it's pretty common in lower income neighborhoods, that there's a lot of businesses, but they're often fairly predatory, right? Or they're often owned and operated by people elsewhere. And so even if the business serves a necessary need in that neighborhood, those dollars are flowing out of the neighborhood. And so with the economic vitality, we're saying, can we get a triple bottom line here? Can we get all of this functioning kind of here in this particular place?
Owned, employed, and
aimed for.
Serving the neighborhood. Wow, that's that really is a triple bottom line. That seems like it's hard to achieve. Like I can imagine, like, a lot of business owners will either come because they found cheap land. They're not necessarily thinking about the neighborhood. But it's a very interesting prospect to say, like, hey, we really want you to grow and think about, and if you serve the neighbors, they will serve you back. They will support your business and help you grow.
Yeah, it is a win-win, and I think there's plenty of stories and examples of businesses having an adversarial relationship to their local environment. And I think we're saying it doesn't have to be that way. Like, we can establish some greater connectivity there. And I don't intend to discredit the need for just more jobs. Like, for the and underemployed that have better wages and better benefits. And oftentimes our answer to that is like, well, who are the like Amazons of the world who can build a huge factory and immediately employ 5,000 people, right?
Right.
And there's good and bad of all of that, but I think when we're thinking about neighborhoods and their health, we're not thinking about a huge factory that serves a population hundreds of miles away,
Right.
even though it may employ people who are local. We're trying to think about how do we not just employ local people in local space, but employ local people in local space that is a business that is benefiting that local space as
Right.
well. Now, there's room for both, right?
Well, and if we think about cities that have really suffered, like the Rust Belt or
Yeah, yeah.
industries that come and go, they can really leave shells
Yeah.
of neighborhoods
Because you
behind.
build, like the whole economy is propped up
Yeah.
on that one thing. And
Right.
so when it comes, there's huge celebration,
Right.
right? Oh, now we've got 3,000 more jobs. But when that goes,
Right.
I mean, you just cut the legs off of a neighborhood. Like
Right,
it's
right.
just gone.
So we're thinking much more sustainably
Yep.
and much more sort of holistically. Again, that word, that interrelated word, holistically and humanistically about a place and flourishing. So, okay, so we've got social cohesion, structural integrity, and economic vitality, belonging, access, and opportunity. I feel like this is all like, again, it's not like we have like colors, or maybe we do have colors, but like, I feel like I should have some sort of composite score here, or some composite way of saying like, hey, maybe it's because I'm Asian. I'm like, I need a grade. What did I get an A? Are we doing a great
David,
job?
you've always got an A+, man. You're good to go. You can tell your mom and dad
That's
you
why
got
I can go
A+.
home. I can go home again. But is that something we should think about as we're doing our work in communities? Is sort of grading and measuring ourselves?
Yeah.
What's a good way to do this?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a both and to this. I think for FCS, who's been doing this for a long time, the benefit of these categories is they've become kind of instinctive. Like this just forms the lens by which we see our place, and so it doesn't have to be a formal assessment project, a great kind of data dig, a formal report. Like it's just like walking from my home to the corner. I'm seeing social cohesion. I'm seeing economic vitality. I'm seeing structural integrity. I'm asking questions about all of that. So at some level, there's this both and of this, just like it's a way to learn how to see and think. But there's also, yes, there is a structured, formal process with tools that helps us to measure and score this. But even with that formal process, which I'll say more about in a second, our greatest wish is that the former begins to happen. Like when people come to visit FCS for a couple of days and to see the ins and outs of all that we're doing here and walk the neighborhood, and we as a team talk about, well, what do we want people to get out of this? And like really what it boils down to is like if people could just learn to kind of like put the lenses on to see their neighborhood, I don't know, maybe this is too old school of a reference, but like see the matrix. Like can you see what we see and how all this is operating so that when you walk the street of your neighborhood or you have coffee with a local neighbor, or you're at a city council meeting, or you're at the local park, like you see it now, right? Like a different set of colors has emerged that you couldn't see before. So that's our ultimate hope. It becomes just instinctive to the way that you engage in neighborhood. But as a part of that, even though I do believe it's instinctive to us, we still actually every 2 to 3 years we follow a formal, structured process with tools to measure and score this. So we call it the Flourishing Neighborhood Index. And so that's a process by which we will organize residents in our community to work together to actually map the parcels in our community to look at the condition of the built environment.
Oh, wow.
And following that, we actually hire and compensate and train neighbors to survey one another in our neighborhood or a neighbor-to-neighbor survey that asks questions about all these indicators I've been talking about. Because it's one thing to go online and say, well, hey, what does Atlanta's crime data say, or what does the city's tax information say? Like, and those things can have their value. But what we're more concerned about is how would a neighbor score themselves or score this neighborhood based on how they experience it in their real life. Because you can talk about crime stats all you want, but what I really want to know is what do people in the neighborhood say about how safe they feel,
Right.
how secure they feel, how
Yeah.
trusting they feel of each other, and how trusting they feel of local law enforcement.
Yeah.
Or how
that would
trusting
be-
that, yeah, it's like I'm more concerned with that than just what's the spots on the crime map, right? And so for us, the Flourishing Neighborhood Index, or the FNI, is a way by which we measure the health of the neighborhood based on the lived experience of neighbors, not just based on publicly available data.
Wow.
And so we do it in such a way that creates a score. Like each of those 3 categories, which each have their own 4 indicators, like each of those 12 total indicators have a score that comes together, and that allows us to not just. And there's nothing like, okay, so your score is a 4.2. Okay, it's just a number, right?
Right.
But what that allows us to do is sit back down with the neighborhood, convened by local neighborhood leadership, and say, hey, we've just listened to almost 20% of this neighborhood is engaged in this conversation over the last 6 months. Here's what we've learned, and let's put all 12 of those indicators out in front of everybody and say, here's where we were 2 or 3 years ago, and here's where we've grown, here's where we've stayed the same, here's where we've lost some ground.
Yeah.
What's that mean to you, right? Like, so we don't just extract this data from the residents and then kind of go into our boardroom and say, hey, here's what this means. Let's update our development plans in the neighborhood. I mean, it does change our plans by what's said, but it's really primarily a way by which the neighborhood listens to itself. And we, as a partner in that, begin to convene, well, what does this mean about our future? And how do we work together to? And it's not about. It's not. I love the pressure of like, did I get the A?
Yeah.
To maybe relieve that kind of pressure. But it's not about the number, but it is about saying, oh, here's your checkup. Like, how are you doing in a health way? What do we need to work on to increase? So that is a process and a set of tools that we use to actually put some measurement to this and put a process behind it. To actually get neighbors defining for themselves, this is how healthy I believe we are. This is where the gaps in flourishing are, or these are the places where our flourishing is really evident.
Yeah, and that would be just a snapshot. Like,
Yeah.
It's how we're doing right now as of the index. But
Yeah.
we might have to do this again.
Yeah.
Or the numbers could change depending on
Yeah.
who else moves in the neighborhood
Yeah.
and what factors change, what organizations come, and what businesses sort of come. So,
Yeah, which is why we're doing it every 2 to 3 years. Right?
see.
There's this sense of like, because we don't think through just like point solutions. We need to fix housing or fix education. Because we don't just think about resources that meet that meet needs, and that we're thinking about the health or flourishing of the whole neighborhood ecosystem. We just assume waking up every day it changed from yesterday. For good, for worse, for whatever it is, it will always be evolving and changing. It's a living organism, a complicated living organism, and so even the act of surveying changes the neighborhood at some level. Just having those conversations change the neighborhood, and so and our hope is like, there are more forces that are going to be coming in the next 24 months that make this neighborhood a different place to live. And so how do we keep the conversation going? Which is why the both and is necessary, of like just developing that instinctive lens and just carry it with you all the time. Both and the work of doing a formalized process that you can document, and that like you're not just living off of impressions and instinct. You say, no, we brought together 20% of the households in the neighborhood to have this conversation, and here's what they've said. And it also gives you a tool to take to your partners who want to know more about neighborhood life. Also gives you a tool to say, hey, if we're gathered as a civic league or neighborhood association, and 1 or 2 people are really upset about this one particular kind of thing, and they're really just trying to push, and like it kind of equips your neighborhood leaders with, hey, I hear you, and I know it's important to you, but like in listening to the voice of the neighborhood as a whole, it really is these other 2 or 3 priorities that we need to give a lot of our energy to. Now, if that's a passion project for you, please go ahead, please work on that. But like our time and resources can't just be defined by whoever's loudest. Like we got to be defined by the collective instincts of a whole neighborhood, and it equips leadership to be able to do that. Kind of work.
I really appreciate that, because I know some people that they're like, well, I grew up in Chicago and I really want this place to look like Chicago, and it's like, well, guess what? It's never going to look like that. But people, I think subconsciously sometimes act in ways that it's like, well, I'm just trying to reproduce the neighborhood I grew up in, and it's like, well, I think you should look at what the neighborhood actually is. Get to know your neighbors as they are, and then figure out how to work with them to build a flourishing neighborhood here that may not look like the neighborhood you grew up in, but it could be even better. If you're willing to make some of those moves in relationships.
Yeah, we had a couple empty parcels down the street from my home, and technically is land that belonged to the city, but city wasn't doing a whole lot with it. Neighbors had been kind of mowing it and taking care of it. Every once in a while, an official city person will come mow it, but not nearly as often as it kind of needed to. But it ended up being a great place for, like, it wasn't a park, but it functioned like one. It's the closest green space that was available. So, my kids would play down there, and the neighborhood would do some like picnics occasionally here and there. And we actually decided to have like just a neighborhood gathering session around, well, what do we most want kind of out of this space? And a local group that the city had kind of given them permission to say, hey, you're a friends group of this park nearby. And this land is going to eventually be kind of consumed into that park footprint. So you guys kind of, have been bequeathed responsibility of it or something like that. Oh, wow. None of them live in the neighborhood. Yeah. I mean, they're great people who do great work, but they do what a lot of great people who do great work do. They just decided, like an edible garden would be great. Like just plant some, different things, and like people can come and snack, And I'm not against community gardens or edible things or whatever. But like, so we're kind of driving by, and it's like we see this like volunteer group. And they'd organize a bunch of volunteers, like with no reference to the people in the neighborhood, right? Yeah. They're out there kind of digging and planting, and we're kind of walking up like, excuse me,
Yeah.
what,
Who are you?
What are you doing? And like they had the authority to have been there. They had the goodwill and good ideas, and like, and what was fascinating is we were able to say, well, could we maybe sit down and talk about this? And we're able to like put in their hands, like, hey, we spent probably 3 months, hosting various conversations, and we came up with like 6 or 9 kind of priorities that came to the surface. And I was like, you should know that a community garden was at the very bottom of that list.
Wow.
Like there were 2 people who really wanted it, and no one else was for it.
Wow.
And then they tried to kind of keep advocating for the value of like this community garden. We're like,
Yeah.
we're not. This isn't a conversation about whether or not community gardens are bad. It's a conversation about what folks here have kind of stated. And so I think there's that sense of like flourishing neighborhood has got to be like, as much as these categories are really important, these indicators are crucial. Flourishing neighborhood is defined by the people who live there.
Oh,
right.
Yeah.
And what one of these indicators might mean to historic South Atlanta versus Joyland or Thomasville Heights or Chosewood or Grant Park or anywhere else, like. And these are all cities that are neighborhoods in the city of Atlanta. They're all stone's throw from each other.
Right.
Like that neighbor's got to be involved in defining that and willing for what they want to see to move the needle forward. And in our book, that's the work of what neighborhood development's about.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thanks.
Yeah.
This is awesome.
Yeah, good conversation. Place Matters is produced by Focused Community Strategies, whose mission is to partner with under-resourced neighborhoods to provide innovative and holistic development that produces flourishing communities and God's shalom. Place Matters is hosted by FCS's training and consulting team, known as the Lupton Center. If you would like to inquire about our training and consulting services, please reach out to us via our website or find us on LinkedIn and social media. This information can be found in the show notes. If you would like to watch these episodes, the videos can be found on our YouTube channel. And if you like these episodes, please share them on social media. Your support means a lot to us. This show was edited by Tim Rhodes with music by Eric North. Special thanks to David Park and Becca Malpass at FCS for their work in organizing and recording these sessions. We'd also like to say thank you to our partner, Lilly Endowment, whose Thriving Congregations grant has made this podcast possible.